The idea of renting something has been around for a very long time. You can rent a car, power tools, and in some cases, even a girlfriend.
I knew that Craigslist ad was too good to be true.
But for a time, one of the most popular rental services was in videos. In 1977, we saw the release of the VHS tape. A company known as Magnetic Video cut a deal with 20th Century Fox, agreeing to bring 50 of their films to the new VHS and Betamax format for home use. While right around the same time in Los Angeles, the first video station store opened its doors, bringing to life the first video rental club in the United States. And though it would take a little while to get going because VCR technology was so new, by the late 1980s, about 62% of homes had a VCR, and the video rental market started to explode, with huge players like Blockbuster opening in 1985 in Texas, and Hollywood Video opening its first store in 1988 in Oregon. And for the first time ever, it was easy for anybody to go to a store and buy a movie that they could watch in the comfort of their own home. But also during this time, we saw the early days of the home console. At this time, arcades were still everywhere, and the idea of playing a video game in your house was a foreign concept to a lot of people. But with early home consoles like the Atari 2600, the Intellivision, and the ColecoVision all fighting for the money in your wallet, it seemed like the video game industry was about to take the world by storm.
Hey, has anybody seen the Atari?
In 1983, the video game market crashed, and there were a lot of reasons why this happened. Having so many players in the industry all competing for the exact same audience made it confusing for a lot of early consumers. And with infamously bad games releasing like Pac-Man for the 2600 and E.T. the Extraterrestrial also for the Atari, which came out after a whopping 5 weeks of development time, it made sense that a lot of people thought that home video games were nothing more than a dying trend. But luckily for us, things were set to turn around just a few years later, with the release of the Nintendo Entertainment System absolutely dominating the market. At its initial release, the NES had 2 separate versions. The Nintendo Entertainment System Control Deck released for $200, while the deluxe set was gonna run you $300. And for the extra $100, you got 2 games included, being Gyromite and Duck Hunt, along with 2 controllers, the NES Zapper, and everybody's favorite motorcycle from Mario Kart World, Rob. Now, if you were to adjust this for inflation in the modern day, this would cost, oh dear God. But even with the hefty price tag, the NES would go on to be an absolute success. And there's a reason that in the modern day, a lot of people will still refer to any electronic gaming console as a Nintendo.
What did I just tell you? Turn off that Nintendo. This is a toaster!
The focus on creating high-quality games made it so people actually wanted to play them. However, with video games being so new, most people didn't want to spend between $40 and $50 on a single game. Luckily, something already existed to make this far more accessible, with video rental stores across the world beginning to add video games to their selection. But in different areas, this didn't come very easily, because in places like Japan, it was illegal to rent these games without the copyright holder's permission. But in the United States, this was a non-issue, because once a video game was purchased, it was completely legal for you to rent it out as you see fit. And since this was a very easy way for these businesses to make extra money, they naturally started adding games to their library. Now, of course, like with any new business venture, this came with some hiccups. Like in 1989, Nintendo sued Blockbuster not to stop their rentals, which was completely legal, but for photocopying video game manuals and including them with rented cartridges.
Well, it's good to know they've always been like this.
Rather than trying to fight this, Blockbuster just agreed to stop copying the manuals, and for the remainder of their time in the space, they would just rent individual copies of said game. But starting in 1986, there was another issue that made it a little bit complicated for players to rent a game, and that was the idea of saved progress. The Legend of Zelda is not only an iconic series that has stood the test of time, it was also the first video game to offer a battery-backed save system on the cartridge, meaning for the first time you could save your progress and not have to start over from the very beginning. And though before this there were ways around this by using a password system, allowing you to input a code to get back to where you were, this new saved game system made it so you would have to delete someone else's progress in order for you to start from the beginning. And though at first this wasn't the biggest deal in the world, it did begin the shift on how video games would be made going forward. Early games like Super Mario Bros. And Contra made it really easy to pick up and play. But as technology progressed, games became more complicated and save states became the standard for most video games. And of course, the main problem with rentals is that you had to make sure the game was actually in stock. Many rental stores would have multiple copies of their most popular games, but that didn't necessarily mean that it was going to be in stock when you wanted to play it. And there were times that you would go to the store to get a game just to be told that you needed to wait. But even with these issues, video game rentals were still the best way for most people to play a game. And when you take the success of the video game market right alongside the boom of VHS tapes, then it was no surprise that these rental stores were popping up everywhere. And all a family would need to get going is a VHS player and a video game console, and they were set for hours of endless entertainment. And throughout the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th console generations, this was the standard way for most people to try out a new game. And though from a game design standpoint, video games were getting more complex, at this time the entire video game industry was shaped around rentals being a key player. And there were video games that were perfect for this idea, with one of the most notable examples being Pokemon Snap. Released on the N64, this was the perfect idea for a rental game, being an on-rail shooter where you are shooting pictures of Pokemon. Compared to the mainline Pokemon games at the time, these graphics were absolutely insane, and you were able to directly interact with the world you were in to get the best photo possible. And going throughout all of the different locations to take pictures of Pokemon was a perfect idea. But this isn't a game you're going to replay over and over again. But it was something that you could rent for the weekend and have a fantastic time. And even other games like Super Smash Bros., Mario Kart, and Star Fox were a perfect game for you to pick up and play for the weekend without having to commit to dropping your entire grocery budget on one game. And as the industry continued to get even more advanced with memory cards and CDs replacing the old style of cartridge, people no longer had the issue of losing their save data when they had to return a game, which even further cemented rental games as the best way for most people to enjoy this hobby. And whether you were renting out a game to play it and never pick it up again, or you were just trying it out before you inevitably bought it yourself, places like Blockbuster, Hollywood Video, and all of the locally owned rental shops were a standard for a reason. But then with the release of the 7th generation of consoles, things quickly started to fall apart. The Nintendo Wii, the PlayStation 3, and the Xbox 360 were a revolutionary step forward for the gaming industry, offering a ton of new features that would completely change the way that people experience video games going forward. Because this was the first generation to offer something that no other consoles had at this time, a digital marketplace. Now these were not the first digital storefronts to exist, because at this point PC players had access to Steam since 2003, and wanting to get in on that action, it only made sense for these consoles to offer their own storefronts as well.
Wow, this is great!
These stores had an advantage that physical media didn't. If you wanted to buy a game, you didn't have to do anything. You could just download it directly to your console, which meant you no longer had to go to a store or a video game rental shop to get the games you wanted to play. And though this wasn't the most popular way to do things, especially at first, over time this became more and more popular, especially with the rise in popularity of competitive online games. These consoles were the first to have a focus on having online functionality. Now, of course, online competitive games existed for a long time before this. But in this era, we saw the rise of the first wildly competitive online console video game series like Halo, Call of Duty, and every single sports game that came out during this time. And this was a very different way to play games than most people were used to, where instead of picking up a game for the story, players were now able to compete online with friends for the first time ever. And though of course online functionality started off on PC and was available on the Xbox and PS2, because of the ease of use for the average person, this was the beginning of the era where having an online mode became a standard feature. And these really weren't the kind of games you wanted to rent, and they would go on to become must-own titles that you would play for months on end, completely changing the way that studios would develop their new games. And then a few years later in 2007, a little-known company called Netflix offered something brand new in the TV space, introducing a digital streaming app that allowed you to watch whatever you want whenever you want to, alongside their existing business model of shipping rental DVDs directly to your door. But surprisingly, despite their success, Netflix never ended up releasing a video game rental service. Which is not to say there were no options for that, because there were services like Gamefly which were available at the time, which took Netflix's idea of the direct-to-your-door movie rental and applied it to video games. Which, just like with Blockbuster, you would play it, and after a certain amount of time, you would just send it back. And apparently Gamefly still exists, which is great to see. But unlike Gamefly, most video rental stores have long gone out of business by now, with Hollywood Video closing its doors in 2010, and all Blockbuster Videos except for one closing their doors in 2014.
Apparently there's still a Blockbuster in Bend, Oregon. Do I need to return my movie still?
And from the late 2000s to the early 2010s, the standard way we experience games has shifted. And if you want to play a game, you have to do so by purchasing it either physically or digitally. And this was the standard for years, but things kept getting a little more greedy. Beginning with the release of Xbox Live in 2002, Microsoft has always charged for online play, with PlayStation and Nintendo both standing their ground and not charging for online for a very long time. And though it was a major selling point for the PlayStation 3 to not have to pay for online connectivity, Sony saw all of the money that Xbox was pulling in from the service and decided to try and get in on the action, which led to the development and release of PlayStation Plus. At its initial launch in 2010, PlayStation Plus was an interesting idea. At the time, Xbox Live cost $50 per year. But for the same $50, you could sign up for this service, which gave you free games every month, discounts on the PlayStation Store, cloud saves, and even more. Now, considering you didn't have to pay for online, this was a great deal. Though you didn't get to pick the games you were given, they alone were worth well over $50. So for the first few years of the service, if you weren't someone who cared about collecting physical games, this was an awesome idea. But with the release of the PlayStation 4 and the 8th generation of consoles, Sony started to bend and made it so you were required to have PS Plus if you wanted to play online. And as somebody who was Team PlayStation during this time, I have never been more devastated in my entire life. But luckily, PlayStation Plus didn't remove the idea of free games and continues to offer them to this day. But the competition between the PlayStation 4 and the Xbox One remained incredibly fierce, with both consoles releasing within a few days of each other across the world. So naturally, in order to keep up with PlayStation Plus, Xbox also started offering discounts and free games along with Xbox Live. And the rivalry between Xbox and Sony would continue to be pretty fierce for the first few years of the generation. Of course, there were other options available during this time, with Steam being more popular than ever, and Nintendo having both the Wii U and 3DS available. They were really trying their best, and everything remained pretty much par for the course up until 2015. When PlayStation decided to do the unthinkable and release their first video game streaming service under the name PlayStation Now. And boy did this thing suck. This was a cloud-based service that allowed you to stream games directly to your console. And at its initial release, it offered a catalog of over 100 PlayStation 3 games, all for the price of $20 a month.
Oh dear God!
If you decided to pay for 3 months up front, you would pay a discounted price of $15 a month, but as someone who signed up for this shortly after release, I can vouch that this was a horrible system. For some simple games, this was really not a bad service, but at the same time, it was far from fun. Having to stream these games and not having the ability to download them to your console meant that you were going to be stuttering and lagging a lot. And unless you had some killer internet that could really handle this, it was not a good service. The selection of games was decent, but at this time, you could take that $20 and go to the bargain bin and get a lot of these games for a very steep discount. And though they ended up adding games for the PlayStation 2 and the PlayStation 4, I never wanted to get this service because most of the games you would have to stream, and the technology just was not there yet. But of course, seeing this, Xbox went ahead and did something crazy. They took the idea of PlayStation Now and made it really good. Similar to PlayStation Now, when this released, it offered over 100 Xbox One and Xbox 360 games that you could play that day. But it fixed the two major complaints that people had about PlayStation Now. First, you could download all of these games to your consoles and play them that day. You didn't have to fight with your family about who's on the internet while you're trying to play Peggle. You could set it to download and play it whenever you want. And that by itself would make this the better product. But this also came at the cost of $10 a month. Being half the price of PlayStation Now and having way more functionality made this the best video game streaming service for its time, especially when it had a solid launch lineup with games like Halo 5, Sunset Overdrive, and Saints Row 4. And though it's a slightly different service, even Nintendo started getting in on the action. Contrary to popular belief, Nintendo does offer online games. And about a year after the release of the Switch, in 2018, Nintendo released Nintendo Switch Online. Now, Nintendo Switch Online is kind of the odd one out when it comes to video game streaming, offering a lot less than the other services do, but for a much more reasonable price. Where at launch, this offered online multiplayer for supported games, cloud backup saves, and access to the Nintendo Switch Online library of NES games. Though over time, they've gone on to include more NES games, Super Nintendo games, and even Game Boy games for the service as well. Though in 2021, they went on to add on the optional expansion pass, where for $50 a year, you get access to even more retro game selections from consoles like the N64 and the Game Boy Advance, and also access to DLCs for games like Animal Crossing New Horizons and Mario Kart 8 Deluxe at no extra cost. And at their inception, these deals were great for the consumer. But that was not going to be the case forever, because as the years have gone by, we have faced a new issue. In June of 2022, Sony decided they were going to merge PlayStation Now with PlayStation Plus. But instead of just combining the two services, PlayStation set up a 3-tiered system of ways you could sign up. There was the Essential plan for $10 a month, the Extra plan for $15, and the Premium plan for $18. Now, the Essential plan is all you need to play online, alongside the staple of getting a few free games every month. The Extra plan gave you a collection of PS4 and PS5 games you could play, while the Premium plan gives you all of the benefits of PlayStation Now alongside a couple new features. And though this was a big change to how things were billed, it really didn't change all that much. They were still missing things that people had wanted, like the ability to download all of these games to play off their console, and same-day releases for games that Sony would be releasing. And just over a year after the release of this new system, they decided to bump up the price, with the Essential plan going to $80 a year, the Extra plan going to $135, and the Premium going to $160. And though you're still given a few free games, paying $80 a year for games that you only get when you're subscribed to the service is so much money. But it wasn't just PlayStation that was raising their prices. Also in 2023, Xbox Live got retired in favor of Game Pass Core. This was mostly the same thing as Xbox Live, however it had one pretty substantial change, which was that they were no longer giving out free games every single month, and instead decided to give out a collection of 25 games you can play with friends. And though this was called Game Pass Core, it really wasn't Game Pass. It was mostly a rebranding of Xbox Live because it didn't offer the same library that the other tiers of Game Pass did. It was a very cut-down form of the Game Pass library that didn't include the day one games. But Game Pass as a service still existed, coming in at $11 for console, $10 for PC, or if you wanted to get both, you could bundle them together on Ultimate for $17. And though it was a little pricey, compared to PS5, this was still a pretty good deal. Though you weren't getting the 2 free games every single month, you were getting same-day releases for all of Xbox's new games. So I can understand for a lot of people, this would still be worth it. But then in September of 2024, Xbox announced they were again increasing the price of the service. The price of Game Pass Ultimate was going up by $3 a month. They also reformatted the service to include Xbox Game Pass Standard, which came in at $15 a month, offering access to the Game Pass catalog, but not any of the day one releases. And also at this time, they started phasing out Xbox Game Pass for console as they wanted to shift people towards the more premium option. And the final change came to Game Pass Core, where the 12-month upfront subscription cost went from $60 to $75. And this rightfully made a lot of people upset. During October of 2023, after a very long process, Microsoft officially acquired Activision Blizzard, one of the largest video game studios on the planet. And during this time, Microsoft was promising that they weren't going to change the price of Game Pass because of this merger. But just over a year later, it looked like they were doing exactly what they promised not to do. But this had to have been the last time this was going to happen. I mean, Microsoft promised.
Oh, what the
October of 2025 saw the largest increase to Game Pass's price that we have seen yet, with Game Pass Ultimate going from $20 to $30 a month, PC-only Game Pass going from $12 to $16.50, an oddly specific price. But the weirdest changes came to how they renamed the other tiers, with Game Pass Core being renamed to Essential because you really have to have it, and Game Pass Standard being renamed to Premium for what I only can assume is a shot at PlayStation.
They just throw any word on a service to make it streaming. Look, I made History Channel Deluxe.
Now, to be fair, they weren't just doing this to bleed every single dollar out of a person that they can. I mean, that was absolutely one of the reasons, but they also added a lot to the service. Game Pass Ultimate saw a couple of new additions that made the service seem more worth it. Both Ubisoft and EA had their own video game streaming services. I don't really know why anyone was buying either of these, but they existed. So both Ubisoft Plus Classics and EA Play were included with the service. And also, starting in November, there's also the addition of Fortnite Crew. Because of course Fortnite has to have their own subscription plan. To be fair, if Mario Kart Tour can have one, anyone can. So with all of these new things being added, plus the day one releases of the 75 plus games that they offer, I can see for some people this still being somewhat worth it. But needless to say, I absolutely canceled. Now this could just be me, but any service that costs $30 a month has to have a long-term value. And if all of the games on the service were never removed, I could absolutely see this being a good deal. But there is a rotating list of games that are and are not on the service, and I really don't love that idea. And because this is a glorified digital rental service, I just don't think it's worth spending $30 a month on. If I'm spending $30, I want to own the games. And I know a lot of people feel the same way. But it's also okay to not. If you think that Game Pass is a good deal and you plan on playing a couple of games on the service every year, then I think it can be worth it. But personally, I would rather use that money to buy more physical games, because $30 a month ends up being $360 a year.
I knew it was your fault.
And personally, the only service that I would recommend in the current day is Nintendo Switch Online. Now, Nintendo does a lot of things that warrant criticism, but the price of Switch Online is absolutely not one of them. The library that is offered on this service is absolutely insane. Some of the best video games of all time are available for you to pick up and play whenever you want. And though I personally prefer the Virtual Console, I think that Switch Online is an absolute steal. And though I have an obvious bias because I like Nintendo games, a full year of Nintendo Switch Online currently costs less than 2 months of Xbox Game Pass. And I know that you don't get the day one releases or Fortnite crew, but I am more than happy to play through Wind Waker for the 9th time. And I think what we're seeing in the modern day is equivalent to the fall of Blockbuster in the early 2000s. With Netflix busting on the scene, changing the way that everybody absorbs content, other companies saw what was going on and wanted to get a piece of the action. So naturally, competitors started popping up left and right, like Hulu, Disney+, HBO Max, Prime Video, and all of the other 300 streaming services you need to watch one show. And though it offered the freedom to watch what you want whenever you want to, it ended up becoming another version of cable TV.
But that would never happen in gaming. Oh crap, I forgot to pay my Rocket League bill.
We are currently sitting on the fence of two equally horrible things. We're either going to see a bunch of developers start creating their own services to try and compete with Game Pass and PlayStation Plus, offering a subscription model to play these games directly from the developer, or we're going to see PlayStation Plus and Xbox Game Pass continue to get more expensive. And though they will offer more content, it will price out a lot of people. But both of these outcomes begin the same way, and that started with the 9th generation of consoles, with both the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series offering a digital-only console. Now, these are not inherently bad. Generally, these are cheaper and have the ability to add on an additional exterior disc reader. So if you want to buy and play physical games, you're able to do that. But due to something that happened in 2020, digital sales now outperform the physical ones. And with services like Game Pass offering a day one release of new games on their platform, I can only see purchases of physical new games going down over time. And as somebody who both collects physical games and has a massive Steam catalog, this confuses me to my very core. I think it's important for people to be able to have value in what they buy. And with a lot of these services, when you buy a game, you're buying the right to play it. You're not owning it outright like you would with a physical game that is on the cartridge. Which makes me feel like we've pretty much come full circle on what the gaming industry was in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. But instead of going to a store and picking out what you want to play, you're now renting the ability to access a catalog of games that you don't really own. And I can see the argument both ways. This gives people a huge catalog of games that they can play on their console in a moment's notice. And being on a service like Game Pass or PlayStation Plus can be a good thing for developers who don't have the marketing budget to push their game like Sony and Microsoft do. But I can also see how this is an overall bad thing for people who like to own the games they play. And the fact that we're seeing the rise of game keycards and digital download codes in video game boxes, removing the ability for someone to pick up a disc and play it that day, is really disheartening to see, especially for someone who wants to collect games. But regardless of where you stand, this seems to be the way the industry is going. And I'm both excited and a little scared for the return of rentals.
What are you doing? Just trying to pick a game. Still, it's been 3 hours. Yeah, so at this rate, I only have 6 more to go.